Dominus vobiscum, amigos. Hope you're having a great day, and today we're going to be talking about Humanae Vitae. It's the 50th anniversary of Humanae Vitae, and it had a lot of impact when it was first released. And a lot of people don't really know about it, or maybe they've heard about it, but they're not really sure what it is, or maybe they've heard stuff about it on the news. So I'm going to do kind of like a 2 or 3 part series here that's kind of going to break down the things that happened with it, what the document is, what it says, what it does not say, and we're just kind of going to go into it and see what happens. So for a little bit of introductory notes. So it was about 50 years ago that it was released. It was written by Blessed Pope Paul VI on the 25th of July, 1968 was when it was released. The title Humanae Vitae in Latin means on human life. It's commonly known as the birth control encyclical or some derivation of that, because that was the primary topic of what was being discussed there. And in all honesty, if we're looking at it, this is probably the most reviled document in the history of things that have been reviled. It was not very kindly taken by pretty much anybody who read it, and it was especially taken poorly by those people who did not read it. So let's dive into what this thing actually was. Let's cover a little bit of the history for it. So after Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, it was called by Pope St. John the 23rd, and he was facing a lot of challenges in the modern world. Things were changing. There was a lot of vocal support for things that were new to the world, and some things that the church had to answer because things were becoming common that were maybe not so in line and in step with church teaching. So basically he created this commission that was going to do research as to whether or not the Catholic position on birth control could change, and if it could, if it should change. So the commission was stacked with a lot of people of a liberal bent in terms of their theology. There were some conservatives too, but it was mostly people who were a little bit more liberal in terms of how they thought about the faith and how they thought about theological and philosophical issues. The majority report wrote that the Catholic position could be changed and that it should be changed, and that artificial methods of contraception were extensions of the rhythm method. This final report was approved 64-5 is how it was approved. So it was very, very one-sided in this report. But Pope Paul VI shocked the world by rejecting the findings of the report, and he penned Humanae Vitae almost in direct contradiction of what this report said. So let's back up a little bit. What did those people who agree say about this? They said that it was natural for man to use his mind and his techniques to subject nature and the physical world to his will and order. Science has given us some incredible advancements, and I don't think that anybody could argue that life hasn't improved because of science, technology, engineering, and all of these things. They also said that it came down to intention rather than method. What the intention of using these methods was mattered far more than the actual methods that were in question. Those who dissented did not agree with that. They said that what we do with our bodies has definitive meaning and definitive purpose in the moral order, that it wasn't just our intentions that made the difference, that what we actually did was more important than what our intentions were in a certain sense. And they made a point that if we were to adopt that stance, we would be admitting that contraception is not intrinsically evil, which was the standpoint of the church all the way up until that point, and that Casti Connubii, one of the other papal letters that was written kind of on the topic of chastity, marriage, and marital embrace and all such as that all of that was incorrect. And this would display a clear aberration from what was true, and that the church had made a grievous error for the past almost 2,000 years at that point. So what did the Pope say? The Pope said no, basically. Humanae Vitae, I'm not going to be able to read the entire thing here just because that's boring to listen to me read stuff, but it's not a very long read, and it's not a very hard read either. And it contains a lot of chin-scratching moments, so to speak. A lot of statements that it's like, when you read it, you're like, man, I gotta digest that. I gotta think about that, because there's something in that. There's something to it. There's meat there. So I'd recommend that everybody read it themselves. So we're going to read a couple of selected sections where the Pope lays out what his stance is, what the stance of the Church is, and then why. And also, what would the future look like if we were to travel down the path of the contraceptive mentality and to change the Church's teaching on those things? What might happen? What might the world look like in that kind of a world? So this is just basically a video laying the foundations. We've talked about the historical foundations a little bit, and now we can kind of transition in and talk a little bit about the philosophical and theological foundations of what the Pope is talking about. So I'm just going to read a couple of little selections, little snippets here and there. I don't know if you can see this, but I've printed this off like a fool on like 8-point font, so I apologize if I get a little squinty in spots. But let's take a look at paragraph 7. This is the first section in a subparagraph called Doctrinal Principles. And the quote goes, "It is the whole man and the whole mission to which he is called that must be considered, both its natural earthly aspects and its supernatural eternal aspects." So let's move a little bit further down to paragraph 8. "Married love particularly reveals its true nature when we realize that it takes its origin from God, who is love, the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named. Marriage, then, is far from being the effect or chance or result of blind evolution or natural forces. It is in reality the wise and the provident institution of God the Creator, whose purpose was to effect in man his loving design. As a consequence, husband and wife, through the mutual gift of themselves, which is specific and exclusive to them alone, develop that union of two persons in which they perfect one another, cooperating with God in the generation and rearing of new lives. The marriage of those who have been baptized is, in addition, invested with the dignity of a sacramental sign of grace, for it represents the union of Christ and his Church." All right, let's unpack that a little bit. What the Pope is saying immediately right off the bat is that this is not simply a material investigation. It's not simply a question about the world, about what scientifically is the case, about what physically happens in the marriage act. It's not about that, because there's a twofold sort of nature to what's happening here. There is the material, which is considered the majority of the time when you talk about this issue, and then there's the supernatural. There is a reflection of the divine life in marriage and in married love, that the two spouses would give themselves to each other fully in an act that is a total self-donation one to the other, and that total self-donation brings forth new life. And in this way, we have the three persons of the Trinity, Jesus, the Father, and the Holy Spirit, who give themselves to one another eternally. And out of that total self-gift of the persons of the Trinity, it brings forth life, love, and everything that we see around us. The creation is the superfluous overflowing of the goodness, of the self-donation, of the love of God. This is what married love is supposed to display and to image. It's a reflection of this divine love. And inside of this reflection, we see the way that the Pope and the way that the Church is viewing the marriage act, and what marriage as a sacrament is, and in how it is to be lived out between the two spouses. This is the foundation that the Pope takes into all of these discussions. This is the perspective of the Church. It's not simply an earthly perspective. It's not simply, let's talk about the marital embrace and everything like that. Let's talk about the methods behind this. No, it's a twofold design. One that shows us the love of the Father, and one that partakes in the very divine love that we see in the Trinity. So these are the foundations. We're going to talk a little bit more about it, but I want to keep each of these videos a little bit shorter so they're a little bit more manageable, and so that I don't just start going off the rails in a whole bunch of different directions. But this is what we have. The foundation that God is love, that God is self-gift, and that we are to image that in our human love. So we'll come back a little bit, we'll talk a little bit more about these married love principles that he lays out, and a little bit more about what does that mean practically in the next video. Until then, stay in the state of grace, have a good day, and God bless.